How's it going, everybody? My name is Luke here with Academy FM, and today we're going to be talking about 15 tips for making Riddim. Before we get started, I just thought the best way to do this would be me kind of going along and making a song with you real quick, just showing how I utilize all these tips within my production day to day and what exactly I mean by each one. All right, so let's get started. For my first tip, it is without even laying anything down, you need to know what you're trying to do and the typical arrangement of it, the tempo, and just the basic things you can lay out without anything actually in the song. And what I mean by that more so is markers are huge. That's a great step. Um, I kind of use markers without even having anything in the song just to place where things are going to happen. So a typical rhythm song is usually 16 to 24 bars of an intro and then a drop. So I'm just going to keep it simple and do an 8-bar intro, kind of a breakdown slash build up at 8 bars. And then on 16, it's going to be the drop. So this already has me moving forward and thinking about what's going to be happening in each stage. And you can even take this a step further and say like drop 2, which would be the second half, and then breakdown slash intro again, pretty much. And the song could just repeat or you could build on. So already I'm further than being stuck in kind of a loop mode or just looking at the same thing for hours on end. And I already know where I want to lay some things down in my track. Along with that, I have my tempo set to 145. Anywhere between 140 and 150 is pretty good for rhythm. And now let's get started. For tip 2, I'm going to say that the kick and snare are just about everything. And what I mean is that having a prominent kick and snare and really solidifying those elements, or kick and clap, especially in rhythm, that's really going to take your track to the next level and bring out the groove and the feel of the whole track. So for this, I'm just going to use a Virtual Riot drum loop because I know it works pretty well. And actually going to take out the in-between hats and separate the kick and snare layers. So to do this, I'll just get the kick there and the snare right here, and everything else I can delete for now. And actually, let's use this loop just because I think there's not a crash in it. Here we go. Okay, and this could be anything from actually finding samples to doing something like this. I'm just doing this kind of for the sake of time. And first off, the biggest thing that's important with having a solid kick and snare foundation is sample selection. So having good samples, and that's like a huge place to start, and you can't really get too far without that. I would say it's just so important to have clarity and good samples. Anything from Cymatics, anything on Splice for the most part, and just look around, find your favorites, find what you know works. That's the only reason I can pick drums so quick like I just did, because I know that these are going to work for me. So what I'm doing is basically just fading out the ends and using these as individual samples. I turn the clip volume on both of them up so they're as loud as they can get. And I'm just going to lay down a simple kick snare pattern for the first 8 bars and then copy the sidechain. After this, let's put a kick here, and we'll copy this for the drop because it's going to be the same thing going on. And then, even to go a little bit more in depth, just since this is the intro, we'll turn all these clips down to about 2. Perfect. All right. So now for tip number 3 is going to be layering a kick and a clap. And to show you this, I'm going to turn off this layer and kind of dive into how I would do that sort of thing. So in rhythm, I often find that a clap layered with a kick is just really powerful in keeping the groove going. If you have just a clap on the snare, it would kind of just feel a little empty, and the kick provides low end. Depending on the song and the case, sometimes I'll cut the kick and the high end out of it, so it's just the low bass coming through, but sometimes the punch of the whole transient kind of sounds nice. So let's find a clap that we can layer with our kick sample and see what we can do. Okay, this one's pretty good. 48's not bad. Okay, and so now this clap is not as greatly processed as the Virtual Riot one is, so let's take this up another notch, kind of, and just do a little bit of processing on it. I'm going to put a simple glue compressor and have the attack somewhere like 10 milliseconds, short release. Really hear that transient clickiness and get it nice and snappy. Perfect. And looking good. And now before we go any further, I'm just going to put a limiter on the master just in case, so we're not clipping. And lastly, to totally take the drums one more notch up, I'm going to put a saturator on, soft clip, and just drive them like 3 dB, 1 or 1 or 2 down in the output. Actually, that's even a little much. There we go. Okay, so now we have a basic kick and snare pattern down. Let's use the same one in the drop. Get rid of all of that. And there we go. And that's tip 3 about layering a clip or a clap with a kick instead of using a snare. I think it just adds kind of swag and helps the groove, as well as the low end really coming through on every like half beat, letting you know like the movement of the track subconsciously. Number 4, the next step I take in writing a track, and the next tip that's important, is writing in sub-heavy keys. Now, this is nowhere, it's not a law. You don't have to do this, but I find it very, very beneficial to write in a sub-heavy key, so anywhere from like D sharp all the way up to maybe F sharp at the highest. And what this is going to do is really just allow the sub to come through powerfully on a system. So if you can hear right now, this would be a D sharp. And this is like an F sharp, kind of the highest I would go, sometimes even a G. But anything other than that, it just really gets kind of tough to hit such a low sub note. And you hear it's just, that's obviously not even a frequency range you would want the sub to be hitting in. But once you get any lower than this, it kind of just starts to get muddy. So I really recommend trying E, F. They're great ways to start, and usually in a minor key, just because that is going to kind of set the mood a little bit darker. But that is also totally to preference. And going off that, tip 5 is going to be having a separate sub bass than your synths or your mids, or the growls, basically. And you'll see kind of as that plays out when we get a little bit further in depth in the project. But what I mean by that is kind of just having this sub layer. So this is just a separate serum by itself. All I got on it is nothing actually. It's just a triangle wave, direct out. And then the processing is actually all in here. It's just a Pletech Wave ZQ pretty simple. It's emulating an old EQ, and it just gives a nice bass boost. And then I have an EQ before that cutting it at 110 and 20 hertz. So it's just tight in there. And having this just gives you the control to like draw it in, really match out what the movement of the synths are doing without getting in the mess of having to worry about some synths hitting differently than others. Like if you say have a project with 15 different serum patches and you're trying to use the sub bass from all 15 talking back and forth to each other, it can just get messy and tough to keep that level even and the sub hitting the same every time. This way, your sub is consistent, you don't have to worry about that, and then you have full control over your mids as well. The next tip I have is getting your sub down first and kind of finding basic phrasing and the groove. So this goes more for the drop section. And let's say we choose to write this song in D sharp minor. So we'll just use a D sharp for the sub. And what I mean by this is just kind of laying down a basic pattern of what you want the sub to do. Okay, so maybe something like this. Bam, 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 bam. Bam, 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 bam. Bam, bam. Perfect. So already it just took a few seconds to lay down a basic groove with the sub, and I can already hear a ton of different options for the way the track could go. And I think doing this leaves you in a much better position to work on the main synth and kind of phrase that sort of thing once the sub is already down first, setting the groove of the song. So now that that's there, let's jump into kind of basic phrasing and using synths. And my tip for this is going to be tip number 7, resampling to audio. So for this tip, let's just draw in on a plain serum, a D sharp. And actually, just for time's sake, we can take this and let's see, opening up a preset that sounds somewhat decent. Something we can just resample pretty quick. Okay, and let's automate the LFO rate just real quick. Okay, so maybe something like this. And that's just kind of playing around, but let's get into the real fun of it, resampling. So my most preferred way to do this is to have a separate audio track and set the input to resampling mode. And then once this is set, you're going to record arm this track and solo what you want to resample. I'm going to turn off the sidechain so we get the full audio effect and hit record. Perfect. So now I can turn off the serum layer and I have this inside of audio. And I find that this gives you a ton of different options in terms of what you can all do and just moving things around, playing with the fades on stuff, being able to modify audio in different ways and just really see what is actually going on. So for tip 8, we're going to kind of jump in more in depth to that and talk about how pitch modulation can make slight variation that is just the kind of a game changer. So say we have this phrase going. And I kind of want to track delay these just a little bit. Perfect. So that negative 13 seconds just kind of makes it come a little bit forward before the kick and the snare, but the sidechain's still cutting it, so it's just kind of giving an off kind of swag to the feel of the synths. So for variation, one thing we can do that is huge is pitch modulation with the resampled clip. So something as simple as just a few dots and lines of automation can make the world's difference, turning something from this into something like this. And now you have two different little turnaround fills. Perfect. So that's tip number 8, pitch modulation inside of synths. And you can even do stuff like this. Simple little subtleties with pitching things up and down can just make a huge change in variation and just be that subtle bit enough, especially in rhythm where it is so much repeating itself. For tip number 10, I'm going to talk about some simple yet affecting processing to bring things out, especially because with rhythm, it is usually something that is pretty minimal layer-wise and like actual element-wise. So sometimes you really need to bring things out in the mix and to make them as present as you want. The multi-band dynamics, which is where the OTT preset comes with, is a very powerful tool. And this is a preset that I made, or I actually found somewhere on Reddit, I believe, someone made, and it's called Post Multiband. And what this is pretty much like an OTT, just upward and downward or compression, and with the output pretty slammed, and the attack and release times set to kind of favor like a bass or a quick moving noise. And with this, I always set the time knob to 1,000, and then you can kind of mix the output to taste as well as the amount. But this is with and without. So you can tell it just kind of brings the synth out up in your face a little bit more, and it's just a simple plugin within Ableton, similar to what I did with the glue compressor on here. Simple plugins can be very effective in bringing things out, just knowing how to use them and executing the proper way, and even sometimes the improper way, and kind of breaking rules. But just knowing your tools, and especially the simple ones like the multi-band dynamics as well as the glue compressor. So for tip 10, bringing things out with simple yet effective processing, and the key elements, just really not anything more because you're trying to focus on that. For tip number 11, we're going to kind of jump into something I hear in rhythm quite a bit, and that would be a sweep with no drums. So Orgalorg by Infect is a good example of that, or any song really. It's become quite popular where the drums kind of cut out for a second and then they'll come back in. So I'm going to do this on the second 4-bar phrase of this little loop we have, and for this I'm going to deactivate the second snare and second kick, or the first snare, second kick, and I'll leave the side chain on for good measure. And let's go down into the mids group and put an auto filter on here. So we're going to want to open up automation and just turn it on until that snare hits right there. And let's start it here. Kind of suck it up. Oh, wrong way. Okay, so something kind of along those lines. And then you can even take a reverb and do the same type of deal. And let's go dry, wet, right about there, and then cutting down. Okay, so as you can see, really nice and simple, just using a auto filter and a reverb, turning them on and off at the right times, and kind of letting that slide in builds just a ton of tension. And I say that a ton in Riddim songs. And one thing that I really like doing is playing around with different ways to do this, like other than your typical filtering or volume automation. Kind of playing with different unique effects that just would give it a different feel when it is sweeping in or doing that type of thing with the synth. For tip number 12, we're going to talk about how a non-synth noise can play a big role inside of kind of the drop, and especially in Riddim. So for this, what I'm going to do is, for our second time around, take the downbeat noise, and since it's a D sharp, I'm just not going to play that. And now let's find maybe a ambient bell sample or something of some sorts to just kind of like a maybe a one shot, a vocal one shot. I'm thinking more of like a bell or a brass type of noise, possibly. Here's a good idea. Let's just go brass one shots, or we could even use a loop. Perfect. Now let's make a new new audio track in our mids channel. Only use this downbeat right here, and we'll fade it and shift drag it. Okay, so without any processing in there at all right now, let's give it a little bit of reverb with a throw. This is just a pretty simple rack, automating the mix with a Valhalla room reverb. And we'll just bring it like this, cut it here. Oh. Okay. So you can see what I mean, a noise or a sound, an instrument, any sort of something that you wouldn't technically expect in a Riddim song. Because obviously that's where the growl is supposed to be, on the one right there. But it's kind of surprising and just tasteful to give them something else, like having a noise play a big role that you typically wouldn't expect. And this is pretty quick because I just did it with a horn, but anything, bells, synths, I encourage you to play around with all sorts of things. Notes that have a key, or any sound that has a key, will do a little bit better than something that's like atonal, but anything really works. The next tip is the role that a fill and kind of turnaround play. And I think this is one of the most important parts of a drop, because it really lets the like listener know when they're going to expect a change. And that's why this right here, and even this one, are so important kind of in letting you know when other things are going to happen. But there's a few things we can do to just spice up those turnarounds with only the few elements we have right here. Pitch modulation is one. So you can go into Serum or whatever you're doing. If your sub bass is audio, you can do it with just transposing it. I'm going to use the pitch bend and automate that down and back up. Maybe. Oh, I'm not even doing it on the sub. Oops. Here we go. Okay. So something like this, along with the change up in here, and let's actually reverse this. So it's going the opposite way. And last but not least, kind of something with the drums. So maybe... Okay, I actually think this turnaround, since it's not as prominent, can go here. And then for this one, let's get... a little kick filter roll going. So similar to what we did with the sweep with the synth, we're just going to take our kick and have it go from high to low. Perfect. And we can turn that on just for that section. So already it gives variation, and it lets the listener know when the next section is going to happen. So focusing on turnarounds is my tip 13, and that one is just very important for cohesiveness and tension in your track. For tip 14, we're going to talk about ambience in your track, setting the mood, and using that to also help build tension. So right now, the intro is pretty dull, and there really isn't anything in there, but just by getting a little bit of ambience, that can make the world's difference. Let's try out a few different things in just setting the mood and the vibe of your song. Let's see if we can find some D-sharp ambience. Perfect. And this is in D, so we're going to have to pitch this up one. Perfect. And now, very similar to ambience, just a impacted risers. Let's find an impact. Make sure that's hitting on the downbeat. Okay, and then just for fun, we can even take this, bring it over here, and let's use that same thing we did right here over here. And just turn this device on up until the drop, and as well as the reverb we had going. And already the song is looking more complete and feeling more whole than it did just a few seconds ago with none of the ambient stuff in there. It really just fills out the space more. And then pitching that up, doing all sorts of things can really take that to the next level. And for my last tip, number 15, we're going to be talking about getting a little more personal with groove and kind of offbeat things and timing things to improve the flow of the song and kind of add your own flair and touch to it, especially when rhythm is such a kind of stagnant genre at times where it's very repetitive and kind of simple. There's a lot of opportunity to break the rules and boundaries there and go outside of the box. So let's find a few just simple one shots. We'll use this and this one. And I'm going to kind of place these offbeat and go into triplet mode with command 3 and just kind of use a little short stab. Okay, and then in this, maybe like a little quick transposition where halfway through it just goes completely down. Okay. And maybe put it right here and reverse. Bump body. Maybe if I take this, zoom in just a little more. Okay. Okay, and just like that, just taking a little sample and kind of adding a personal touch, my own little groove to it, made it that much more unique and the flow come out that much more. And this is the final product using my 15 tips to make rhythm and help you with your production. Hope you enjoyed watching. I'll see you next time. Thank you.